Welcome to the first installment of our three-part mini-series on royals rumoured to haunt the places they once called home. We've thoroughly researched their chilling stories, recounted by numerous eyewitnesses over the years. In this video, we'll be sharing the first 7 tales. We hope you find these stories as fascinating to listen to as we did researching them. The story of Anne Boleyn remains one of the most famous and tragic chapters in English history. Her life was a whirlwind of power, romance, and religious change, ending in a violent and sudden death that shocked the nation. Because she died in such a dramatic way, many people believe her spirit never found peace. Today, she is often called the most well-travelled ghost in Great Britain. Her ghost is not just a single story, but a collection of sightings across many different castles, homes, and churches that were important to her during her life. These stories help us understand how she has been remembered over the last 500 years, moving from a woman accused of crimes to a tragic figure of legend. To understand why so many people claim to see her ghost, it is helpful to look at how she died. She was arrested and taken to the Tower of London. She was accused of very serious crimes, like being unfaithful to her husband and even plotting against him. Most historians now believe these charges were fake, created by court advisors because the king wanted a new wife who might give him a son. On May the 19th, 1536, she was beheaded by a skilled swordsman. The sudden end of her reign and the unfairness of her trial created a strong feeling of unfinished business that fuels these spooky stories. The Tower of London is where Anne spent her final, terrifying days. Because this is where her life ended so violently, it is also the place where her ghost is seen most often. Witnesses describe her appearing in different ways, sometimes as a beautiful woman in a white dress, and other times as a terrifying figure without a head. One of the most famous stories from the Tower of London happened in 1864. A soldier was found passed out while he was supposed to be on guard duty outside the Queen's house. In the military, fainting on duty was a very serious crime. When the soldier was put on trial, he explained that he hadn't fallen asleep. Instead, he claimed he had seen a white figure emerge from the thick fog. The soldier told the court that he shouted at the figure to stop 3 times. When the figure kept moving toward him, he charged at it with his bayonet. To his horror, the weapon went straight through the woman as if she were made of smoke. He felt a sudden flash of energy, like a shock, and then he fainted from terror. While the court might not have believed a single soldier, 2 other witnesses confirmed that they saw the soldier challenge a figure and then lunge at something that wasn't there. Because of their testimony, the soldier was found not guilty. After the execution, her body was placed in an old chest and buried under the floor of the chapel of St. Peter ad Vincula within the tower walls. This lack of respect in death is often used to explain a famous sighting by a captain of the guard in the late 1800s. Late one night, the captain saw a strange light coming from the locked chapel. He grabbed a ladder and climbed up to look through a window. Inside, he saw a group of knights and ladies dressed in old-fashioned clothing. They were walking in a slow, formal line down the centre of the church. At the front of the group was a woman who looked exactly like the portraits of Anne Boleyn. The group walked toward the spot where she was buried, and then slowly faded away into the darkness. Blickling Hall is a beautiful country house that stands on the site of an older home where Anne is believed to have been born. Local legends say she returns there every year on the night of May 19th, which is the date she was killed. This is considered one of the most spectacular ghost stories in all of England. According to the legend, as the clock strikes midnight on May 19th, a ghostly carriage pulled by headless horses arrives at the hall. The horses are driven by a headless coachman. Inside the carriage sits Anne herself, dressed in a white gown. In this version of the story, she is holding her severed head in her lap. Some people who claim to have seen it say the head is still dripping with blood. The carriage drives quickly up to the front doors of the house and then suddenly disappears. After the carriage vanishes, her ghost is said to enter the building and walk through the long hallways and rooms until the sun comes up. In contrast to the scary stories of the tower, the hauntings at Hever Castle are much more peaceful. The castle was Anne's family home where she grew up. Because she had many happy memories there, people believe her ghost returns to find comfort. Most of the sightings at the castle happen on Christmas Eve rather than the anniversary of her death. People believe this is because Christmas was her favourite time of year. Witnesses have reported seeing a woman in a white dress walking across the bridge on the castle grounds. One of the most famous spots at Hever Castle is a very large old oak tree. According to history and legend, this is where Anne spent many hours while she was being courted by the king. Many visitors and staff members have claimed to see her ghost standing under this tree. Some people have even reported feeling a cold spot in the air when they stand near it, as if someone is still there watching. One of the reasons there are so many stories about her ghost is that people have never been quite sure where her body really is. While she is officially buried in the Tower of London, there are many local stories that say her friends secretly moved her remains to other places. In Norfolk, there is a very old legend that her body was taken from the tower in the middle of the night and brought to Sal Church. This church was the burial place for her family for a long time. The story says she was buried under a plain black stone with no name on it so that her enemies wouldn't find out. Because of this legend, people often report seeing a white lady wandering the churchyard at Sal as if she is guarding her secret grave. Another strange story comes from Wharton Hall. It is said that Anne loved the area so much that she left instructions for her heart to be buried in the local church. In the 1800s, during building work at the church, workers found a lead box shaped like a heart hidden in a wall. While no one can prove it was hers, the box was reburied with a plaque that tells the story of her heart. Marwell Hall has a more vengeful ghost story. Legend says that while Anne was in the tower, her husband was already at this hall, planning his next marriage. Because of this betrayal, her ghost is said to walk in a part of the garden called the Yew Tree Walk. People have reported feeling a bone-chilling cold in this area, which they believe is her spirit still feeling the anger of being replaced. In the era she lived in, people were very superstitious. Many of the spooky stories about Anne started while she was still alive, often created by her enemies. Even when she was at her most powerful, people noticed signs that things would end badly. During her coronation parade, it was said that the wind blew her crown crookedly. There is also a story that she found a prophecy book in her rooms that showed a picture of a queen missing its head. One of the most famous stories about her physical appearance is that she had a sixth finger on her right hand. Her enemies claimed this was a witch's mark. Modern historians believe these stories were mostly lies made up after her death to make her seem like an evil sorceress who had put a spell on the king. In reality, she was known for her beauty and her style, but these descriptions have stayed part of her legend for centuries. The most well-travelled ghost in Britain continues to walk through the hallways of history. Her story is a mix of real tragedy and spooky imagination, creating a spectral legacy that shows no signs of disappearing. Among all the figures who are said to haunt the ancient palaces and dark towers of the land, few are as famous or as frightening as Catherine Howard, the fifth wife of King Henry VIII. This young woman, who was likely only a teenager when her life ended, has left behind a legacy of sadness and fear that continues to be felt by visitors and staff today. The legend of the Screaming Queen is centred on her desperate final moments at Hampton Court Palace, where she tried to save her life before being taken to be executed. I do have another video on the channel about the hauntings of Hampton Court Palace, featuring Catherine Howard. I will link it in the description and at the end of this video. This video explores the many other stories associated with her, the specific places where she is seen, and the modern encounters that keep her legend alive. While her arrest occurred at Hampton Court Palace, Catherine's final days were spent at the Tower of London, the fortress and state prison. This site is known for its long history of beheadings and is considered one of the most haunted buildings in the world. Catherine Howard was executed on the 13th of February 1542 at Tower Green, a site inside the Tower of London used for private executions of high-ranking prisoners. Unlike the king's second queen, who was given the mercy of a swordsman, Catherine was beheaded with an axe. On the night before her death, she reportedly asked for the execution block to be brought to her room so she could practice how to lay her head upon it. Guards at the Tower of London have reported seeing a white figure resembling a woman appearing and disappearing near the memorial on Tower Green. On the anniversary of her death, February 13th, some claim to hear screams echoing across the site. These screams are said to be loud enough to wake guards sleeping in the nearby Waterloo barracks. Catherine's spirit is also said to haunt Gainsborough Old Hall in Lincolnshire. She stayed at this manor house for 3 days in 1541 during a royal tour. It was during this stay that some of the secrets regarding her past were uncovered. The hall is famous for a ghost known as the Grey Lady, seen most often in the Tower Room. While local stories often identify this ghost as a woman named Elizabeth, who died of a broken heart, many visitors connect the heavy, spooky atmosphere of the tower to Catherine Howard's visit. Catherine's rooms were likely located on the first floor near this tower. People have reported seeing shadows and feeling terrified in this part of the building, and some have witnessed a female figure disappearing through a wall where a secret door was once located. During the Victorian era, interest in the Queen's ghost grew as spiritualism became popular. Many of the stories known today were first formalized and shared with the public during this time. In the early 1900s, Hampton Court Palace sold postcards that claimed to show real photos of Catherine's ghost. These photos often showed a translucent figure in the horn room. While these were later revealed to be double-exposure camera tricks, they were based on real accounts from residents who claimed to have encountered a restless royal in the dark. Not all reports of Catherine's ghost involve screaming. In 1897, a medium held a séance in the darkness of Hampton Court Palace. Instead of the expected screaming queen, she reported a radiant being with a childlike face and blue eyes. The spirit reportedly spoke to her, describing herself as a lonely child who had been neglected and used by others. This account offers a more humanized view of the Queen, suggesting that her spirit may be seeking the understanding and protection she lacked during her life. Historians have noted some inconsistencies in the legend. For instance, records suggest the king may have left Hampton Court Palace before Catherine was informed of her arrest. If the king was not there, she would not have run to the chapel to find him. However, the power of the story persists because the emotions are real. Catherine Howard was a teenager who met a violent end. Whether the sightings are emotional memories or actual spirits, the legend of her restless spirit ensures that her life and death are never forgotten. The history of the royal family in England is filled with many dark and strange stories. Among all the leaders who have sat on the throne, King Henry VIII of the Tudor family left arguably the most frightening legacy. He was a man of great power who lived in massive residences like Whitehall Palace and Hampton Court Palace, but his life ended in great physical pain and anger. Because of his intense personality and the violent events of his reign, many people believe his spirit still walks through the great buildings he once owned. These stories are based on reports from people who visit or work in these locations today, describing sounds and sights they cannot explain. The king is most famously said to haunt Windsor Castle, a massive fortress that sits on a hill and has been a home for royals for 1,000 years. This castle is especially important because it is the place where the king is actually buried in a vault within St. George's Chapel. Many people have reported encountering the king's ghost in the hallways and the areas known as the cloisters. In his older years, the king became very large and suffered from many health problems. The most painful was an open infected sore on his leg that never healed. This caused him great agony whenever he moved, and he walked with a very distinct and heavy step. Today, witnesses at Windsor Castle often report hearing the sound of a very heavy man walking through the castle corridors at night. The sound is always described in the same way, a loud, heavy footstep followed by the sound of something being dragged. This is believed to be the king's spirit, still suffering from the pain he felt in life. Along with the footsteps, people often hear loud groans and sighs of pain. Beyond just sounds, some people claim to have seen the king's form at Windsor. He is described by witnesses as a large, imposing figure who appears to be very anxious or angry. He has been seen pacing furiously back and forth in the Dean's cloister, sometimes shouting loudly as if he is still arguing with people from his past. People who have encountered this spirit say it feels as though the king is still full of the same rage and power he had when he was alive. In the Tower of London, in the heart of the city, there is a gallery in the White Tower where the king's impressive suits of armour are kept on display. This area is known for a very specific and frightening type of haunting. Several guards have reported a terrible, crushing sensation that suddenly descends upon them as they enter the room where the king's armour is kept. One guard even reported the feeling of a heavy cloak being thrown over him and pulled tight around his throat by an invisible attacker. When he managed to escape the room, he had marks on his neck that seemed to prove something had actually touched him. Many believe this is the king's aggressive energy still lingering around the items he used to show off his power. Additionally, in 1890, a guard at the Beauchamp Tower reported seeing a bloated red face that resembled the king from history books. The face reportedly chased the guard down the hallway before vanishing. Some of the spookiest stories about the king come from the time of his death and funeral. Years before the king died, a religious man warned him that if he did not change his ways, dogs would lick his blood after he was gone. When the king finally died at Whitehall Palace in 1547, his body was placed in a heavy lead coffin to be taken to Windsor Castle for burial. During the journey, the coffin was left overnight in the ruins of Sion Abbey. According to the legend, the coffin was so heavy that it cracked or leaked during the night. In the morning, workers found a stray dog licking the floor beneath the coffin, exactly as the man had predicted years before. There is also a story about the king's very last moments at Whitehall Palace. As he was dying, he was said to be terrified and looked into the dark corners of his room while shouting the word "monks" over and over again. Some people believe he was seeing the ghosts of the many religious men he had treated poorly during his life, and that this final fear has kept his spirit from finding peace. The reason these stories continue to be told is because the king was such a massive and frightening figure in history. The sounds of his dragging leg at Windsor Castle or his angry presence at Hampton Court Palace serve as a reminder of his difficult final years. Whether it is a strange figure on a camera or a heavy feeling in the Tower of London, the king's presence is still felt in the historic buildings of England today. Queen Jane Seymour was the third wife of Henry VIII. Her death stands out as particularly sad. On October the 24th, 1537, the Queen died. But just days earlier, on the 12th of October, she gave birth to a son, the future King Edward VI. For hundreds of years, staff, residents, and visitors at several historic sites have reported seeing a figure that matches the description of this queen. These accounts often focus on a quiet, pale woman who seems to be reliving the final moments of her life, or searching for something she lost. This story examines the specific sightings, the locations where she is said to appear, and the spooky details that have been passed down through generations. The primary location associated with the ghost of the Queen is the Royal Palace at Hampton Court. I do have another video on this palace, which also features Jane Seymour. I will leave a link in the description and at the end of this video, so you don't miss out on the rest of her sad story. Before Jane became a queen, she lived at her family's estate known as Wolf Hall. While the original grand house where she grew up is no longer standing, the site remains a major focus for paranormal activity. The current owners of the land, a family that has lived there for several years, have shared many stories about the strange things that happen on the property. The owners have noted that many people who visit the site of the old manor feel a sudden, strong presence. This is often described as a sensation that makes the hair on a person's skin stand up. It is not just a feeling of being watched, but a heavy atmosphere that suggests the ground itself remembers the events that took place there centuries ago. The foundations of the original building remain buried in the dirt. The owners believe that the energy of the family, including the Queen, is still attached to the land. They have reported hearing unexplained noises and feeling cold spots in the newer buildings that sit near the original site. Some writers and historians have described the energy at Wolf Hall as a form of creeping evil. This refers to the idea that the family who lived there was so focused on gaining power and wealth that they left behind a dark spiritual legacy. The Queen is often seen as the one pure member of this family, but her ghost is still tied to the place where her family plotted their rise to the throne. Because several members of her family eventually met violent deaths by execution, the hauntings at this location feel more intense and less peaceful than the sightings at the royal palace. The current owners have even called in psychics and mediums to try and clear the ghosts away, because the activity was so disturbing to them. Marwell Hall was another property owned by the Queen's family. It is a place where she is said to have spent time with the monarch during the period when they were planning to get married. This location is famous for a specific path called the Yew Tree Walk, which is lined with very old dark trees. Local legends say that the Queen's spirit can be seen walking through the grounds. These sightings are often linked to the happy times she spent there before the pressures of being Queen led to her early death. However, there is a darker side to the ghost stories at this hall. This location you may remember from a previous story in this video. The reason for that is some reports claim that she is not alone in the gardens. There are stories of another spirit, the Queen who came before her, who also haunts the Yew Tree Walk. In these stories, the previous Queen is said to stalk Jane's ghost. This suggests a haunting fueled by a sense of betrayal. There is a long-standing rumour that the Queen was secretly married at Marwell Hall. Some versions of the story say the wedding took place on the very same day the previous Queen was executed in London. While historical records show the official wedding happened elsewhere, the ghost story persists. It is believed that such a high-tension event would leave a spiritual stain on the house, which explains why the atmosphere at Marwell Hall is often described as heavy and full of secrets. After her death, the Queen was buried in a vault under the floor of St. George's Chapel at Windsor Castle. This is her final resting place, and it is a location shared with her husband. Because they are buried together, the hauntings at Windsor often involve both of their spirits. While the Queen is not seen walking at Windsor as frequently as she is at Hampton Court, her presence is felt in the silence of the chapel. Visitors have reported seeing strange, shadowy figures near the area of the vault. In one famous case from the late 1800s, a visitor reported seeing 4 black statues that seemed to move and then disappear when they tried to look closer. One of the most remarkable stories about the Queen's ghost comes from an account in 1897. A woman named Mrs. Russell Davies claimed that she was able to communicate directly with the spirit of the Queen. This account is unique because it moves beyond just seeing a figure and into the realm of conversation. Mrs. Davies claimed that she first saw the Queen at Hampton Court Palace. The spirit was sitting in a large, bare room in front of a fire. The ghost seemed to be listening to distant sounds of many feet and the loud laughter of a man. Later, Mrs. Davies tried to use her willpower to call the spirit to her while she was at home. According to her story, a rush of icy cold air filled her room at 3 in the morning. The ghost appeared, but was very unhappy. The spirit told Mrs. Davies that she was only there because she was called against her will. She said she was being held by other spirits and could not find peace until she fixed the wrongs she had done during her life. This reinforces the idea that the Queen felt a great deal of guilt for taking the position of the woman who had been executed before her. During this ghostly conversation, the spirit made a very sad statement. She said that she was the wife of the king, but she was a queen in name only. She claimed that he only ever had one true queen, his first wife, and that all the others, including herself, were not legitimate in her eyes. The ghost also spoke about the king's character, calling him unprincipled and cruel. She claimed that she never realized he would actually kill his previous wife just to marry her until it was too late and she was already committed to him. This story provides a rare glimpse into the psychology of the ghost, suggesting that her spirit is stuck in our world because of the fear and regret she felt during her final months. The ghost of Queen Jane Seymour remains one of the most famous and well-regarded spirits in British history. For nearly 500 years, the stories of her quiet, candlelit walks on the Silverstick Stairs have fascinated the public. Her haunting is a unique blend of historical fact and supernatural legend. The legacy of Mary, Queen of Scots, is not merely a collection of dates and historical documents, but a tale of folklore, mystery, and reported paranormal activity. Her life was dramatic, defined by royal splendor, sudden betrayal, long years of captivity, followed by a tragic end. This tragic emotional history has created a fascination into her life, death, and of course the afterlife. Born on the 8th of December 1542, and just 6 days later on the 14th of December 1542, she became queen, following the death of her father, King James V of Scotland. On the 15th of October 1586, she was found guilty of treason and sentenced to death. She was executed on the 8th of February 1587 at Hever Castle. It took 3 blows of the axe to behead her. She was just 44 years old. The ghostly journey of Mary, Queen of Scots, begins at the very locations where she held power and faced her first great tragedies. These grand palaces and castles serve as the foundation for her identity as Britain's so-called busiest ghost. Stirling Castle holds significance as the place where she was crowned as an infant. The most frequent sighting at Stirling Castle is known as the Pink Lady. This apparition is described as a beautiful woman dressed in a flowing pink silk gown. She is typically seen walking from the castle gates toward the nearby church, a path she would have taken many times during her childhood and later visits to her son. Accompanying the Pink Lady is another spirit known as the Green Lady. This figure is believed to be a loyal maidservant who served the Queen. According to the spooky story associated with her, the Queen was once asleep in her bed when her curtains caught fire from a nearby candle. The maid noticed the fire and managed to wake and save her mistress, but she was badly burned and died shortly after. Her ghost is now seen as a guardian spirit, appearing in various rooms as if she is still checking for fires and ensuring the safety of the royal household. This story highlights the theme of loyalty that follows many of the Queen's ghostly accounts. The Palace of Holyrood House in Edinburgh was the scene of one of the most brutal acts in the Queen's life. In 1566, while she was heavily pregnant with her son, her second husband and a group of lords forced their way into her private supper room. They dragged her private secretary away and stabbed him dozens of times, some accounts say 56 or 57 times, before throwing his body down a nearby staircase. As you could well imagine, this violent event is said to have left a physical and spiritual stain on the palace. To this day, visitors are shown a dark, reddish-brown mark on the floorboards of the outer chamber where the secretary fell. Legend says that no matter how hard the wood is scrubbed or how many times the floorboards are replaced, the stain always reappears in the exact same spot. This is a classic example of geographic imprinting, where a traumatic event is believed to be recorded into the very fabric of a building. The Queen herself is also reported to haunt the halls of the palace as a white lady. She is seen as a melancholic figure dressed in white, which was the colour of mourning for French royalty at the time. Witnesses often describe a sudden drop in temperature and an overwhelming feeling of being watched in the rooms she once occupied. In the 1990s, a diplomat reportedly fled from a room in the palace after seeing a terrifying, pale figure approaching him, which some believe was a witness to the original violence of the 1560s. As the Queen's reign collapsed and she was forced into hiding and eventually prison, her spiritual map expanded to include isolated island towers and massive stone fortresses. Lochleven Castle, situated on an island in the middle of a loch, was a place of deep personal loss for the Queen. She was imprisoned there and forced to sign away her crown while suffering from the loss of twins she had miscarried. This dual trauma of losing both her power and her children is said to be the reason her ghost is so active at this site. Her ghost is most often reported in the Glasson Tower, where she was kept under guard. Visitors today describe hearing footsteps through the ruins. The story suggests she is eternally searching for her lost twins, who were reportedly buried somewhere on the island. Some witnesses have glimpsed a pale woman near the water's edge, or praying by an old window. The air in the tower is said to grow cold with a residual sorrow, a term used by researchers to describe an atmosphere that feels heavy with the grief of the past. At Borthwick Castle, the Queen faced a desperate situation when she and her third husband were surrounded by a large army of angry nobles. In a daring move, she dressed herself as a page boy and climbed out of a narrow window to escape into the night. Because of this specific event, her ghost at Borthwick Castle is unique. While she is sometimes seen as a regal woman in the Red Room, she is also frequently reported as a young boy wandering the stairwells and the grounds. Creignithan Castle is the site of perhaps the most frightening sighting of the Queen. She stayed there briefly after escaping from her island prison, seeking help to regain her kingdom. However, local folklore suggests that the spirit that haunts this castle is not the woman who stayed there in life, but the woman she became after her death. According to these stories, a headless lady dressed in white has been seen in the old tower of the castle. Because the figure has no head, it is difficult to identify her by her face, but the clothing and the timing of the sightings led locals to believe it is the Queen returning to one of her last places of freedom after her execution. When the Queen fled to England to ask for help from her cousin Elizabeth I, she was instead kept as a prisoner for the next 19 years. Her long years of confinement in various manors and castles created a vast number of spooky stories across the English countryside. In 1568, the Queen was held for several weeks at Carlisle Castle. Though she was allowed to walk in the gardens, she was always under heavy guard. A famous and terrifying report from this location dates back to 1842. A sentry who was on duty in the early morning hours saw a woman's figure approaching him. He followed his training and shouted for her to stop, but she ignored him and kept walking toward him. Desperate to stop the intruder, the soldier charged at her with his bayonet. To his horror, the weapon passed through the figure, and she vanished instantly. The shock of realizing he had tried to attack a ghost was so intense that the soldier collapsed. He was found by his fellow guards and managed to tell them what happened before he died of fright shortly after. At Bolton Castle in Yorkshire, the Queen spent 6 months while her future was being decided by her cousin's advisors. The castle is a massive stone structure that still feels very much like a prison today. The current owners and staff of the castle have reported seeing a woman they call the Lady in the Dark Cloak. In one instance, a witness saw a woman in a dark coat walking across the central courtyard toward the east curtain wall. The witness waited for her to come back out, but she never did. Other reports describe the Queen appearing alongside another woman, with both wearing long, hooded capes, one white and one black. Ghost hunters at the castle have recorded footsteps on the floors and ghoulish cries in the dark, which they believe are linked to the Queen's unhappy stay there. Because the Queen's son later ordered Fotheringhay Castle to be torn down, many of its stones and timbers were used to build other things. The Talbot Hotel in Oundle was rebuilt using these materials in 1626. The most important relic in the hotel is the oak staircase. Legend says this is the very staircase the Queen walked down on the morning of her execution. Her ghost is frequently seen on these stairs, appearing as a figure in a long dress descending slowly. Guests staying in the Mary Queen of Scots room at the top of the stairs have reported hearing the sound of a woman crying through the walls for hours at a time. One guest even claimed they felt a clammy hand pushing them against the bed in the middle of the night. The spooky stories and ghost sightings associated with Mary Queen of Scots are more than just tales to scare tourists. They are a reflection of her dramatic and sorrowful life. From her childhood at Stirling to her final walk at Fotheringhay, every stage of her journey is marked by reports of her spectral presence. The haunting of Kensington Palace by the spirit of King George II is one of the most well-documented and enduring tales in the history of the British royal residences. For more than 2.5 centuries, accounts have described a persistent ghostly figure that roams the palace. He stares from the windows and mutters some kind of phrases. In the weeks and months leading up to his death on the 25th of October 1760, from an aneurysm, aged 76, the king was in a state of constant worry, waiting for important news from his troops and dispatches from his homeland. Because of poor weather and unfavourable winds, the ships carrying this news were unable to reach England, leaving the king in a state of agonising suspense. This period of intense waiting is believed to be the emotional anchor that keeps his spirit tied to the physical world. On the morning before the king died, he woke up at his usual time, around 6 a.m. He appeared to be in good health and showed no signs of illness. He called for his servant to bring him a cup of hot chocolate, which he drank while looking out the window at the weather. He was particularly concerned about the wind, as he was still hoping for the delayed letters from overseas. After finishing his breakfast, the king told his staff that it was a fine day and that he intended to walk in the gardens. However, shortly after the servants left the room, they heard a loud noise, a heavy sigh followed by a crash. When they rushed back in, they found the king on the floor. He had collapsed while using the toilet, an event that is often described as undignified in historical and paranormal accounts. The king had suffered a sudden and massive internal injury. Specifically, a large blood vessel near his heart had burst, a condition known in modern times as an aortic dissection. As he fell, he hit his head against a piece of furniture, leaving a visible injury on his temple. He was able to speak only a few weak words, calling for his daughter, before losing consciousness and dying shortly after. One of the most specific details of the king's haunting involves a weather vane located on the roof of the palace. During his final days, the king was obsessed with this tool because it told him the direction of the wind. If the wind was blowing from the west, ships from the mainland could not reach the English coast. He needed an easterly wind to bring his messengers to him. The king would spend hours staring at the weather vane, hoping to see it turn. This behaviour has carried over into the afterlife. Numerous sightings describe an apparition of the king standing by a window, his eyes fixed on the roof where the weather vane sits. He is often seen during blustery weather, particularly when the wind is blowing in the wrong direction for ships to arrive. While visual sightings of the king are common, many people report hearing his voice. The most famous auditory phenomenon associated with King George II is the sound of him asking a specific question: "Why don't they come?" In some accounts, he is heard saying, "Why won't they come?" The voice is described as being deep and having a very strong German accent. Witnesses often hear these words echoing through the empty corridors of the palace, or coming from the rooms where the king spent his final hours. The phrasing, "Why don't they come?" is frequently used in stories to describe the exact sound of his voice as he mutters in frustration. The King's Gallery is a long, ornate room that was a central part of life during his reign. It is also one of the most active areas for ghost sightings. Witnesses have reported seeing a shadowy figure drifting through the gallery at dusk. This figure is said to resemble the king in his later years, moving slowly and looking at the portraits on the walls. The king's staircase is another location where his presence is felt. This grand entrance to the state apartments is often the site of cold spots, sudden, unexplained drops in temperature that occur even in the middle of summer. Visitors and staff members walking up the stairs have reported the feeling of being watched or the sensation of someone standing just behind them, only to find no one there when they turn around. Perhaps the most chilling of all the stories is that of the pale face seen in the palace windows. For centuries, people walking in the gardens after dark have looked up and seen the image of King George II looking out from the second floor. The face is described as being extremely pale and having a look of intense longing or sadness. The window in question is the one where the king stood on the morning of his death. Some witnesses have claimed that the face is so clear that they can see the king's distinctive features and the mark on his temple from his fall. This manifestation is often seen as a sign that the king is still keeping his watch, forever looking toward the horizon for the ships and news that will never arrive. One of the more unique stories associated with the king involves a young boy who was found living in the wild in Germany and brought to the palace. The king was fascinated by this boy and took him under his protection, ensuring he was cared for within the royal household. The boy lived at the palace for many years, but was never able to learn to speak or behave like a typical courtier. After the boy's death, his ghost was also said to haunt Kensington Palace, particularly the nursery and the king's staircase. Because the king was the boy's primary protector, their hauntings are often linked in folklore. Some believe that the boy's spirit is looking for the king, while others think the king's spirit is still watching over the boy. This relationship adds a softer, though still spooky element to the king's ghost story, showing a side of him that was protective and kind. The stories of King George II's ghost are more than just simple fright tales. They are a reflection of a man who was deeply human, with all the worries, frustrations, and longings that people feel today. His haunting is characterized by an eternal wait, a state of being where he is forever stuck in the moments before his death, looking for news that will never come. King Richard III is one of the most enduring mysteries in English history, extending far beyond the political battles of the 15th century into a complex world of supernatural sightings and spooky folklore. For over 500 years, the memory of this king has been kept alive not just through history books, but through stories of a restless spirit that supposedly haunts the places where he lived, fought, and was eventually buried. These stories range from medieval prophecies to modern-day recordings of unexplained voices. Leicester holds the most significant concentration of lore concerning King Richard III, as it was the city where he spent his final nights and where his body was brought after his death. The transition of the king from a living ruler to a ghostly figure began in this city, specifically within the walls of a famous inn and along the banks of the River Soar. In August 1485, King Richard III arrived in Leicester on his way to meet his enemies in battle. Because the local castle was not in a good state for a king to live in, he stayed at an inn then known as the White Boar. The White Boar was the personal symbol of King Richard III, and the inn's name was a sign of loyalty to him. However, after the king died in battle, the innkeeper reportedly became worried about his safety under the new rulers. Legend says he quickly painted the sign on the front of the building blue, changing the name to the Blue Boar Inn to hide his previous support for the king. The most famous spooky story about this inn involves the king's bed. He was known to be very particular about where he slept and did not like using strange beds. Because of this, he travelled with his own large wooden bedstead, which was set up in the best room of the inn. This room had a view of the street, a large fireplace, and ceiling beams decorated with painted patterns in red, black, and yellow. After the king died, the bed was left behind, and a rumour grew that it contained a hidden treasure. Stories tell of a later owner who supposedly found a fortune in gold coins hidden in a false bottom of the king's bed. This discovery led to a dark history of robbery and murder at the inn, which many believe left a permanent, spooky stain on the site. Even though the original building was torn down in 1836, people have reported seeing a white, misty figure near where the inn once stood. Some say the king's presence is still felt in the area, particularly in the modern buildings that now occupy the site on Highcross Street. As King Richard III rode out of Leicester toward his final battle, a spooky event is said to have occurred at Bow Bridge, which crossed the River Soar. This bridge has become one of the most famous landmarks in the king's ghostly history. According to the legend, first written down in 1611, the king's spur struck a stone on the bridge as he passed by. An old woman watching the procession supposedly made a grim prediction. She said that where his spur had struck on the way out, his head would strike on the way back. After the battle, the dead body of King Richard III was brought back to the city, slung over the back of a horse. As the horse crossed Bow Bridge, the king's head reportedly swung out and hit the very same stone his spur had touched, fulfilling the prophecy. For centuries, this story made Bow Bridge a place of local dread, and many residents believed the area was haunted by the king's unhappy spirit. Another spooky story associated with Bow Bridge was that the king's remains were eventually dug up and thrown into the River Soar. This legend suggested that the king was denied a peaceful grave, and that his ghost might be wandering the riverbank. Although this story was proven wrong when his skeleton was found in a grave on land in 2012, the spooky reputation of the river and the bridge has lasted for hundreds of years. Before the body of King Richard III was discovered in 2012, the site was a simple car park used by social services. However, there were many stories about a strange feeling in that specific location. Those who were looking for the king's grave reported that they felt a strong pull toward the area. One researcher famously described a powerful sensation that the king's ghost was trying to communicate his location, guiding them to the exact spot where he had been buried, in haste hundreds of years earlier. When the archaeological dig began, the discovery happened almost immediately. The skeleton was found within the first few hours, in the very first trench. Many people found this speed to be quite spooky, as if the king was ready to be found. The skeleton itself was battle-scarred, with several serious injuries to the head and a noticeably curved spine, which matched the historical descriptions of the restless king. The king was reburied in 2015, and the focus of ghostly activity moved to Leicester Cathedral. The cathedral was later named one of the most haunted places in the region, partly because of sightings related to the king. One notable story involves a psychic who visited the cathedral and took a photograph of a stone slab near the new tomb. She claimed that when she looked at the photo, she could see the clear image of King Richard III's face in the stone. She also described feeling a very strong and real presence of the king, suggesting that he may still be watching over his new resting place. The discovery of his remains in 2012 did not stop the ghost stories. Instead, it seemed to start a new chapter in his spectral history. As long as people are interested in the mystery of his life, it is likely that the ghost of King Richard III will continue to be seen in the shadows of the ancient castles he once called home.